We'll be moderating your panels today, Shukri and I. It's been such a lovely afternoon, and this is going to be a great end and leading us into our keynote. So this is, as you know, our last panel, Urgent Education. We're going to be using a variety of methods to explore questions of education. This panel will discuss curricula, student centers, youth education, and higher education with questions around students of minoritarian identities. We are also here attending jointly with the Gender and Sexuality Center's weekly events, Feminist Friday, which I also lead every Friday. Panelists will have up to 15 minutes and we'll be sending you direct messages when you have 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left. So y'all can, get a sense of where you're at. Also, if you're running a little bit over time and it's over like a minute over 15, we're definitely gonna have to unmute, unfortunately. So just keep mindful of the chat. We're gonna begin with Julia. Her title is My Voice and Our Stories Are a Lot More Important, the Curricular Desires of Pre-Service Teachers of Color. Julia is a teacher, scholar, mama who loves learning about feminisms, critical race theory, indigenous epistemologies, and neurodiversity. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Savannah. I'm gonna put my timer on too. Okay. So this this presentation is drawn from my dissertation study, and it's dealing with kind of the second findings chapter, which I have not fully gone into yet. So this is very much drawn from my kind of outlining, working through the arguments that I want to make. So any feedback or thoughts would be really awesome to hear, because I'm still working through articulating the different arguments and whatnot. I'm Julia Echternock. I am a doctoral student in curriculum and instruction, specifically cultural studies in education. And the title of this one is My Voice and Our Stories Are a Lot More Important, the Curricular Desires of Pre-Service Teachers of Color. Oops. So a little introduction to this study. The reason that I chose this study is I was teaching a sociocultural foundations course for pre-service teachers, where we cover a lot about race, gender, class, and colonialism and how they impact schools. And when I first started teaching this class, I had been reading a lot in whiteness studies and about ways that the predominantly white teacher workforce thinks about whiteness and ways to engage those teachers in conversations about race. But when I was teaching this class, I noticed that the students of color in it had really different responses to the content, and there was a whole range of different responses, and I just hadn't been introduced to as many readings about the ways that they might respond to the course content, and I wanted to learn more about it. So for my dissertation study, I interviewed 7 pre-service teachers of color about their experiences in our teacher education program. And the research question around this was, how do race-conscious pre-service teachers of color describe their embodied and relational experiences while moving through their teacher education program? So I conducted 3 interviews with each participant. If I could find them for all 3 interviews. 2 of them got really overwhelmed. But we talked about their embodied experiences in their different courses that they were taking inside and outside of teacher education, their sense of relating or not relating to others in the class, and different ways that they responded to the curricula in their courses. And in working through the findings from this study, I ended up focusing one chapter on whiteness and the different ways that it manifested in their programs and how they responded to it. So this presentation is drawn from the second section of things that I looked into, which is other aspects of relationality in their teacher education program. So when whiteness was not something that was really the primary thing that they had to think about confronting, what are other ways that they related to their peers or sought belonging and connection while they were in their teacher education program? So that's the section that this presentation is drawn from. And the participants who I interviewed, I kind of introduced them here. All of these are pseudonyms. And I tried to think of 3 words that related to each participant, but I'll try and go over this briefly to talk more about the findings. Maxine identified as Chinese. She was bilingual, and that was a big part of her identity. She was very empathetic and very affectionate with others around her. And she was kind of quietly angry. She might not come out and show it all the time, but she would talk about it underlying a lot of her experiences. Grace identified as Filipino, Japanese, and white in terms of her ancestry, but often called herself racially ambiguous. And she was someone who studied a lot in a lot of different departments and drew from all this different background knowledge when she was thinking about teaching. Judith identified as Peruvian and sometimes as Latina, depending on the context. Language was also a big part of her identity, and she was very reflective about the practices that she used in her classroom. She was someone who was actively working in schools throughout her program. Eva was identified as Hispanic and Mexican, was very rooted in her community that she had grown up in, and was very adept at navigating through systems, schooling systems. Denise also identified as Hispanic and Mexican American, but totally different from Emma. These participants were all so different from one another. She was a lot more reserved and loved helping others. May identified as Black primarily, and she took a very pragmatic approach to her education and to her teaching at first, as I'll discuss later on. Anna also identified as Black and came from a whole family of Black teachers. Her mother, her grandparents, her aunts had all worked in schools for decades. She could tell me exactly how many years they had worked in schools. So being a Black teacher was a really central part of her identity and her family. And she was very confident and very social, always had a positive outlook. So in the slides that follow, I'll try and identify some themes that stood out in their experiences and teacher education programs and focus in on 2 of these participants in particular. Okay, I'm already taking way too long. That's my specialty. It's taking too long on these beginning slides. Oops. I'm sorry, I feel like these are out of order. Okay, so one thing that I noticed that was really surprising to me at first was the responses that participants had to affinity groups. Some of them avoided groups on campus that could be described as affinity groups because they felt that these spaces were rooted in an essential idea of racial identity. And a lot of these participants would describe, I'm Black, but I'm not that kind of Black. I'm Filipino, but I'm not that kind of Filipina. So Anna, when she was taking a Black studies class, talked about how many of her peers in the class ended up getting in these arguments about what kind of Black are you that supports this, or what kind of Black are you that supports that. And it was the first time that she'd really seen those tensions within a really diverse group of Black students. And she wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And it wasn't a space that she necessarily sought out again after that. However, spaces that had a shared purpose could lead to a sense of belonging. So Grace identified as Filipina and Japanese. However, she ended up getting involved with this organization of Latino men who tutored youth in schools. And through that process, she learned about a lot of different racial inequalities that manifest in schools. And she described feeling like a community with other people who are interested in the same thing, ironically, again, in this Latino dominated space. So even though she didn't share the same identity as the group, they were all focused on this shared goal of improving educational outcomes for students of color. And that led her to feel really comfortable and feel that she could actually relate more to others. And the part that I really want to expand on is that when participants had opportunities to talk about their lived experiences without feeling that they would be stereotyped or tokenized when they did that, when they had opportunities to learn more about their family and community history, for example, through a family history project or through an ethnic studies course, And when they learned ways to do the same for their students in their work as teachers, this had a really transformative effect on them. So once they knew what it felt like to be able to do this in a either community education space or in a teacher education classroom, they wanted more of it and they wanted to go deeper, which I'll explain more in just a couple of minutes. And they felt more prepared to challenge interpersonal and institutional racism than they may have previously. So sometimes when they entered the program, and when I first started interviewing them, they really went into survival mode in predominantly white spaces, as I'll describe in just a second. But when they started learning more about the history of their racial ethnic community and their family, and when they started learning more about strategies that they could use in their classroom with their students, they then felt like, I don't just have to survive these spaces. I can also look for opportunities to take action within them. So one example that I want to focus on is Judith. As I mentioned before, she identified as Peruvian, sometimes as Latina, and being a Spanish speaker and having grown up as an English language learner, which is the typical label put on these students in schools, was a huge part of her identity and of how she saw teaching and what she wanted to focus on as a teacher. So when she started her teacher education program, at the same time, Judith ended up working with a local Mexican-American community organization that provided bilingual, culturally relevant extracurricular programs for local elementary students. And it was kind of by chance, her third or fourth day in Austin, that she ended up working there. And she just loved this space. And so every time that I talked to her, she was becoming more and more involved in this community organization. So this was a space that she felt had a clear purpose of promoting students' language, promoting students' culture, really accepting using Spanglish in that space. And that was a place where she really felt that she could be herself and relate to others. Right. However, in some of her teacher education courses, which she generally liked other than this, and at the schools where she was working throughout, this is a very stubborn cat. She noticed that English language learners were often misunderstood or often not prioritized. And that that created a lot of frustration for her because she so strongly identified with these students. So that community organization was a haven for her throughout her program. She even tried out an affinity group for students on campus. It was for pre-service teachers specifically who identified as Latinx and as first generation. So it was kind of rooted in this idea that these students would share an essential identity, even if that wasn't explicitly stated. So that space was okay for her, but it didn't serve the purpose that she thought it would. She was really interested at this point in her journey in thinking more about how she had internalized beliefs about racism and assimilation that she wanted to intentionally unlearn and wanted to look at in her own mindsets and challenge in what she was doing in her classrooms. She wanted to unlearn the kind of deficit thinking practices that she might that might be impacting her teaching. So she started to desire something else that both her teacher education program and her community organization were not totally providing for her. So she started taking on more leadership roles in this community organization. She was still there, but she really wanted to find more about how she could support these English language learner students. And she wanted to have a space to express the Peruvian part of her identity, because this group that she was in was really oriented around Mexican and Mexican-American history and culture, which she believed was really important, especially for the student population that they were working with. But she wanted to be able to also be Peruvian and have a place to express that and talk about it even more with students. So that's why I was really interested in this process in which when teachers had access to some of this culturally relevant learning, they started wanting more and more of it. I'll try and go, okay. Okay, sorry. So I think I've got about 2 minutes. I had a quote, but I think I'll skip that and go through this example. So May was a teacher who, when she started her teacher education program, she had gone to school in Texas and had some pretty awful schooling experiences that are not necessarily unusual, especially for a lot of predominantly Black and brown schools throughout the state, right? So school had taught her to always stay in survival mode and view education as a transaction where her job was just to show up, do her work, and get her diploma. She really loved authentic learning and engaging in that with young adults, and that's why she wanted to become a teacher. But she kind of didn't expect to get those engaging learning experiences out of school. So even when she took classes that were focused on race and related to her personal experiences, she didn't speak in those classes because she was one of the only Black students, and her white peers weren't speaking up in that class either. So she felt that she'd be stereotyped. But later on, when she got to learn about her family and community history, and when she felt that her peers were on the same page, she started talking about education and about her experiences at school, and about her teaching in totally different ways than she had 2 semesters previously. So when she had access to these courses where she could actually reflect on her own experiences and share them with others, she really felt that she could actually act with agency in these schooling settings where she had previously had to stay in survival mode. So I'll put these conclusions up here. I'll try and go through these really quickly and focus on the second too. So shared political purpose could really create a sense of community even more than essential identity for these pre-service teachers of color. And when they had their opportunity to talk about their personal experiences and explore their histories, they wanted to see even more changes in their teacher education programs and in the schools where they worked. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was fantastic. Just so we are staying good on time, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panelist. I'm very excited to see how y'all's work crosses over and is in conversation with each other. So our next panelist is Alex. Alex will be presenting a project titled Longing for Belonging, an exploration of institutional support for trans and non-binary college students. Alex is a current master's student in the program for higher education leadership at UT Austin, planning to pursue doctoral work in the future, and works as an academic advisor in the Vick Center for Strategic Advising. Their research interests include non-binary inclusion in gendered Greek letter organizations, multicultural Greek lettered organizations, and trans inclusion in queer campus resource centers. Join me in welcoming Alex, everyone.
Hello, thank you for that. So give me just a second to figure out all of my screens. I have 2 and I will definitely be using them all, but I've got to figure out how to share the correct one. Okay. Can I get a thumbs up in the chat from just someone if you can see it? Awesome. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Alex, and I will be sharing with y'all some of just kind of our preliminary data that I have regarding trans-specific resources. Hello. Trans-specific resources provided by colleges and universities. So unfortunately, Liz could not join us today as she is currently in San Diego for a regatta. So I will be presenting on our research. This project started with me just kind of browsing through other institutions' websites, searching for just kind of honestly the name of their queer centers, just because at UT Austin, we have the Gender and Sexuality Center. So I was just kind of interested whether their names exist. And so when I was doing that search, I kind of found a large array of different resources, organizational structures for providing students with these resources, and honestly, quite a few sparse looking websites. And so when I started kind of writing all of this information down of what I was finding, I decided that I wanted to more intentionally start collecting all of this information. I had pulled a list of US institutions from the 2021 Carnegie Classifications Report and discovered that there were almost 4,000 institutions. So I turned to Liz, who is also my roommate and happened to be sitting on the couch behind me at the time, and asked if she wanted to help me collect all this data, and she was crazy enough to agree. So while this is an ongoing project and we are nowhere close to being done, we do have some emerging patterns to share with y'all today, and hopefully maybe present more concrete data for all US institutions next year. So firstly, I would like to just provide some quick background information to frame this research and give context to everyone here. So queer communities and spaces often center folks of queer sexual orientations and kind of leave behind folks of queer gender identities. And so that's something that I want to just kind of acknowledge in addition to kind of the stressors associated with the student's journey through college. Nick Lazo, along with Goldberg and Kublanka, write of the additional stressors that trans students experience because of their gender identity, or experience because of their queer identity, but also the additional layer of stressors related to their gender identity as well. And then just on top of that, non-binary students have even further layers of stressors by not conforming to, quote, the expectation of a more exaggerated or transgressive gender performance to conform to stereotypical and socially constructed gender norms, end quote. Additionally, Goldberg and Kublanka write that the queer community kind of lumps the sexual orientation and gender identity groups together that don't necessarily identify along similar lines, end quote. While having distinct experiences, the two halves of the queer community can and have historically come together to support and empower each other in the context of queer resource centers on campuses. So I think that there's definitely this, uplifting presence that can, and I hope, and I would argue should, be in these centers. But that's kind of what we're looking at, is what is the state of these queer centers really focusing in on that half of the community that is gender diverse. Kind of bringing it back to a little bit more of the college-centeredness of this research, that stemming from initial research by Durkheim, Tinto presents a model detailing the relationship between the sense of belonging and integration at an institution and increased persistence rates. So definitely using kind of on like more of the higher ed side, using this model to kind of drive the fact that, we argue that this integration and sense of belonging, community kinship is what queer resources can provide and should provide for trans college students. So in order to actually collect our data, what we have been doing is we are assuming the role of trans or non-binary student at an institution, searching for resources specific to our gender identity. While having general resources for the general queer community is wonderful, we are specifically looking for mentions of gender as opposed to sexual orientation, and trans-specific resources, things like a university health center offering hormone replacement therapy. So basically what we have been doing is conducting a website search on each institution's homepage using the terms queer, LGBT, and trans to find their version of a campus queer resource center. From there, we've been categorizing each of the resources as one of 10 types: restrooms, name, pronouns, physical, mental, external, programming, tangible, housing, and other. And I'll get into how we've kind of defined those tags in just a moment. Some things to note before moving on into kind of more of the data, because this is a very like data numbers based kind of research, is that we have only been looking at our public and private R1 institutions at the moment, meaning doctoral granting institutions that Carnegie classifies as very high research output. So out of the 3,935 US institutions, 137 of them are R1. And so again, like I said, this is ongoing research. So this is what we have been able to complete at this moment. So we will only be looking at R1, these large high research output institutions. So these patterns that I present in just a moment may or may not hold true for all US institutions. Time will tell once we have the time to actually go through all of them. Additionally, we are not specifically looking at intersex resources, of which we currently have not found any. And given that, based off of what we have found so far, R1 institutions are a little bit more likely to have those resources, and we haven't found any yet. So I am not very hopeful that we will find any. But that is not kind of our scope of this current research project, although I do think that it's an area for growth and things that should be offered, but not currently our scope at the moment. And lastly, even if the institution does have the resource, we did not include it in our tagging system if it was not easily accessible. For instance, we found a lot of websites that give 404 errors, or they just aren't linked correctly, or the links are very circular. It'll send you to a women's and gender studies like an academic department, and then it'll send you right back to whatever their queer resource center is, and then it just goes back and forth and back and forth. So even if it mentions something like that, if we can't actually find any like concrete resource, we did not include it. So now we have some pretty data visualizations that I hope will be good for folks who are not necessarily data minded. My bachelor's is in math, so I like numbers. And so I have here just kind of general prevalence of trans resources. So just kind of going through each of the different tags. Restrooms, that's going to be any mention of gender neutral restrooms, or like campus gym facilities, things like that, that are going to be gender neutral here. 79.6% of our 137 R1 institutions have that. External, this is just going to be links to anything from like the Trevor Project to outside counseling services. Name, if they have any sort of resources for changing a name within either an internal university system or legally changing names, those resources were tagged with name. Housing, that's going to be gender inclusive, all gender housing opportunities on campus. If it mentioned anything in terms of like off campus, we did not include it. This is specifically residence halls. Programming, anything that is, you know, an institutional department is creating some sort of trans specific programming, whether it be like Trans Awareness Day, or like some of them will have like a support groups that are kind of facilitated by full-time staff as opposed to like a counseling center, things like that. Pronouns, any just kind of information about what are pronouns. Physical, that's going to be the on-campus university health services office, whatever their medical facilities are, is offering some sort of trans inclusive services, whether it be like hormones or surgery or just generally saying that they are trans affirmative. Mental, that's going to be specific trans contacts within a center for counseling and mental health services on campus, or general support groups specifically hosted by the counseling center as opposed to full-time staff within a queer resource center. Tangible, it's exactly what you'd think, like physical items that they can give to folks, whether it be a trans-specific scholarship, or another one we found was like gender inclusive clothing closets that folks can go into and get clothes out. And then of course none, meaning that they had no resources. So here's just a couple little pie charts of kind of the distribution of what percentage of these R1 institutions had. On the left side here, we have number of resources. So of course 10.9% of them had no queer or no trans specific resources. They may or may not have had queer resources, but again, we're looking specifically at trans. So you can see that there, this little blue one is supposed to say a 1. I don't know where that one went. Yeah, so you can see that kind of a lot of them are up in this, up to 9 tags, which is super great. And then here we also have type of resource organization. So we also kind of defined, how are these students getting these resources, whether it be an actual center that has at least one full-time staff member dedicated to queer services, an initiative, which is what we defined as a part of a larger office, whether it be student life, diversity, equity, and inclusion office, something like that, that doesn't have a specific staff member directly, overseeing specifically queer things, a website that's not really hosted by any specific department that we could find. Of course, we had none. We had other, which was usually just like a combination of things. And then this tiny, tiny little slice here is committee, because sometimes we have found, especially at the community college level so far, we found committees where it's, think kind of like our PEPSA, where it's like a university resource group kind of thing hosted by faculty staff, but they have a website that has some sort of resources for queer and trans students. Here, I just wanted to kind of look at the number of queer resource types by region. So these are the different kind of regions that Carnegie kind of creates, defines. And so you can see that our far west, so all of our California schools mainly, have been pretty high up in the number of different types of resources they provide, whereas our schools in the Southwest are a little bit lower. Namely, our Texas schools have been the main culprit there. So just kind of a note for folks who are data minded. This is not a statistically significant difference. However, we have not had a lot of data yet. So I think that this might end up being something that we'll see be statistically significant in future. But I also felt the need to include the obligatory rainbow into this presentation. So there you go. And then kind of our last little graphic. This one's not nearly as pretty, I apologize, but these are our two statistically significant factors in kind of this number of resource types for R1 institutions, specifically the type of resource organization we have. So again, as I said, we kind of defined centers, initiatives, and websites. And you can see that websites, those are typically going to have just less things. Mostly they're going to be external links. It makes sense just because they're not having specific teams of staff members paid to provide these resources. And then you can see other, we only had very, very few number. I think we had 2 that we tagged as other. And then we had 1 committee. And then of course, if they had no center, they had 0 resources. So that's why that one's a line. And then land grant institution was the other kind of random one that I was not expecting, but you can see that those institutions that are land grants typically had a higher number of resource types, which was awesome. And then just some general findings that kind of wanted to highlight here. Some of the tangible resources we found included multiple forms of contraceptives, specifically with the language of external and internal condoms, and dental dams, all the things, as opposed to male and female condoms. That was a pretty common tangible resource type that we found. Another common one, as I think I mentioned a little earlier, is a collection of clothing, some sort of closet for gender inclusive clothing and binders, things that students can take for free. Another common feature that we found across multiple institutions is the use of student employees and volunteers for running the physical spaces for queer centers, which I thought was interesting. And our funniest find comes from Colorado State University, where they listed some examples of students who might be interested in all gender housing. They listed depressed or anxious students requesting a non-binary gender roommate for support, which cracked us up. I don't understand why they would put this, but apparently depressed and anxious students need to rely on non-binary roommates for their further support. And then real quick, just to wrap up kind of our next steps, we hope to continue collecting data over the summer to expand to additional institution types. For example, we have not looked at many community colleges or HBCUs yet, so very intrigued to see what we find there. However, the community colleges we have looked at thus far seem to be far less likely to have institutional resources besides a staff-led committee. So we'll be interested to see how that turns out. And then some additional factors that may or may not become significant that we will continue to look at include selectivity, region, research expenditure, urbanization, whether or not the institution's a Hispanic serving institution or not, and time will tell. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me and what would have been Liz. And if you want to contact us about our research or want to see what happens in whenever we finish it, feel free to email us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alex, for your presentation. Now we will, and Liz also. Now we will move on to Sarah Hutchinson. So Sarah's title is Writing for Our Lives, Queering Youth Education. Sarah is a second-year master's student of public affairs at the LGBJ school studying social policy and gender. Prior to returning to school, Sarah taught middle school French and English in Mississippi, and later after school and summer programs in New York City. You have the floor, Sarah.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, y'all. Let me pull up my slides. All righty. So, okay. Super excited to be in conversation with you all. Really enjoyed the first two presentations. So my name is Sarah, I use she and her, and as you guys already heard, I'm studying public policy, social welfare policy, and gender, but my background before that was in youth education, and both directing after school programs and teaching. And I wanted, my goal, my intention today is maybe a little bit different. I wanted to actually share with you all a curriculum that I helped develop, and I wanted to present it because in thinking about, this theme and thinking about queer in this kind of expansive way, I wanted to share this curriculum because I hope that it offers like one example when we think about what might it look like to queer youth education. I think it possibly provides like one useful intervention. And so this curriculum that I helped develop is developed for a program called Girls Write the World. And I'm just realizing I forgot to start my timer, so I'm gonna start that now. Okay. And Girls Write the World, it's a youth serving organization based in the Mississippi Delta. We provide poetry and empowerment workshops. We run a summer camp every year. We've been running a summer camp since 2015. We also produce like weekend writing retreats as well. And you guys are probably already aware if you follow the news, but Mississippi, it is a very conservative state. There's a case around abortion access that came out of Mississippi that is being decided before the Supreme Court right now. The Mississippi Delta itself is a high poverty community, and there are barriers to access, like in terms of things like abortion care, or in terms of things like sex education. So I don't say any of those things, to say that like that's what that place is, but just to like kind of illustrate some of the dynamics that exist there. So I'll tell you a little bit, I'll give you a little bit more of a sense of what the Girls Write the World programming is, and you'll see there are pictures that I'm going to share, and these all I have asked permission from the campers, and there's a little bit of writing that I'll share later, so just that's an FYI. So just to give you a sense of what the program that I'm talking about is, I'll talk about the summer camp. So the summer camp, in the mornings, every morning, it's poetry workshops, and then that center around a different theme. The theme might be anger, the theme might be loss, the theme might be identity, joy, memory, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the afternoons, we host these like kind of life skills workshops. I feel like that's not the most precise way, but workshops that include sex education, self-defense, college admissions processes, that sort of thing, to give you a sense. So that's what the programming kind of looks like. In addition to that, there's always a showcase, which is always really beautiful, and I always cry, where the campers, perform the works, the pieces of poetry that they've developed over the course of camp. And one other thing that always happens is there's always a college tour, where we take the campers to a college campus. They meet, college admissions counselors, etc. So that's just a really fast and quick overview of what the Girls Right the World Youth, the program is. And what I want to spend the rest of my time now is sharing an example of curriculum that was developed for the program to give you all a sense of what it's like. Again, you know, with like the thinking about this as perhaps like one example of what queer and youth education could look like, because this curriculum really centers emotion above all else. I think that, and this is something that Julia alluded to, you know, I think that our young people so often are going to schools that are like incredibly restrictive. I mean, and often cases they're also like heavily policed. And there's not a lot of space for that social emotional component. And so like this curriculum and this experience was really developed in response to that. That's the intention behind this. So I'm gonna now just sort of like lead you through as though you were a camper, what would be the activities that we would do. And I wanted to share our curriculum that was centering the feeling of rage. And this is actually a theme that since I think we did our first Rage Day like 2016, but ever since then, it's like every time campers are always like, we have to do Rage Day. Rage Day is everything. Like Rage Day is really important because like, I don't think there is a lot of space for us to process our feelings of anger. I think it is like, it's for one thing, not safe very often, right? And I think that, but you have to suppress those feelings. And it's actually like, so logical to be mad about a world that treats you badly, that is disrespectful to you, that is oppressive. Like it's so normal and reasonable to be enraged by that, but there just aren't very many spaces, I think, for young people to process that. So that's sort of my framing, and I'll take you through it now. But just to show the learning goals, this is sort of like the North Star for like a counselors and our counselors when we're leading these experiences. Says campers will be given space to reflect upon their own rage and power, and we'll study a collection of poems and discuss how these artists channel their anger to build power, and we'll take our anger seriously. And so the first thing that we do in this activity was we had a group discussion where we asked people to think about a time that they needed to be told that they were told to calm down. I think a lot of us probably know that's a little bit of a there's a flag, you know, there's a red flag when you hear that sometimes because you know, you're reacting to something that made you mad. So it's like, calm down. It's just, you know, it's not helpful a lot of times. So that was our initial kind of brainstorming. That's always really, really fun to just have everyone kind of share their stories and their memories. And then the next thing that we do is that we have a group vent session, and we ask the campers, let's make a list. Let's think about all the different things in your life that you've experienced that pissed you off. And you can see, I'll share this, and I have one other slide of some things that when we think about what makes us angry, like these are some things that came up. When people call us crazy, when people call me a bitch, people ask too many questions, like, yes, that is so annoying. When people don't listen, when people touch our hair, like, you know, there's so many, it was very, very, very generative. And I'll show you another slide, you know, too much homework, big crowds, loud noises, all these different things that are enraging. Some of them are like, you know, you can see like kind of explicitly political, and some of them are more small everyday things. But the intention behind this experience is just to affirm that like all of them are important and like all of them really happen, and like just to sort of be a mirror for that experience. Because again, I think that it's just very hard to process these kind of feelings. And I think it feels good to sort of be able to share them collectively. So that is activity number 2. And then after that, we ask the campers to have we ask them to reflect, do a brief writing reflection. They all have journals. And in this case, we ask them to reflect on this passage. I'm sure some of you all have come across it, from Audre Lorde, where Lorde writes, "My anger has meant pain to me, but it has also meant survival. And before I give it up, I'm going to be sure that there is something at least as powerful to replace it on the road to clarity." And so we ask campers, what do you think that means? What's that my anger could mean my survival? What are some potential benefits of anger? What might anger be teaching us? Like, what is it? What can we get out of it when we notice that in our bodies? And so they reflect on that. And then after that, the next activity is we do poetry study. And I'm always the one typically that picks the poems, and I'm always like, let's read 10, and we never have time. So I'm only gonna show you guys one, but we typically study 3 or 4. And the intention here is to show our campers models of other writers who are experiencing that feeling of anger too. These are all poems that are sort of righteous rage poems, and showing them a model of how they've used those experiences to create art and sort of what they've got out of it. So I'm not, for the sake of time, gonna read the entire poem. Oh wait, I forgot, I meant to. These are examples of some of the things that our campers reflected on when we had that writing response, which I really love. Say anger is natural, anger is art, anger is the first step to change. So I just think, yeah, I just love seeing this because I think it's really affirming, and you know, to go back to that sort of, we're just constantly being told to calm down. It's nice to be like, no, like there's a meaning to my anger. I'm not actually crazy. I'm reacting to this world that is enraging. Okay, so now to go back to our poetry study. This is a poem by Portia O, who's a really amazing slam poet. If you guys haven't heard of her, definitely check her out. She's amazing. And this is a poem that she wrote in which she was describing a situation where she was at a store at a checkout, and the cashier just reached out and touched her hair. And so she's describing this experience that is incredibly enraging, right? I think this is a really, really powerful poem because, I mean, it's just poetic in the first place. And we actually watched her slam performance. So definitely YouTube it later because it's really, really great. But I'll just read you a little bit of it. She writes, "This freckle-faced redhead says, if you don't mind me asking, is it yours? Is it weave? Can I touch it?" And then she goes on, and this is like the righteous rage part that I love so much. "I wish I was kin to Medusa. I wish now my hair would grow heads and bite his fingers bloody, and he would jerk back his hands. I wish my hair could morph into switchblade machetes or knives. I wish each strand was a rope so I could hang each of his fingers to death, levitate his hands from my scalp. Don't he know my scalp is holy ground? My hair is magic. I think I put a spell on you, boy." I scream to no one as I hand him my money. So I think that's such a great poem. The campers definitely, respond really powerfully to it as well. And again, it's just like this model of trying to, I guess, just offer a model of like what the validity of anger and remind each other of that. And then also like how can we use anger in a productive way? I think this poem is one of many examples. So after we do the poetry study, I know I'm almost at time. So we have the campers share poems themselves, or write poems themselves, excuse me. And that's always really, really so powerful and awesome. They're asked to create their own poems of righteous rage. I wanted to share, just in conclusion, 2 examples of campers' poems to give you a sense of, what is being generated. And these are both, like I said, I'm sharing these with permission. This is one poem that was written by one of our campers in response to this lesson. And she writes, "I'm angry that one day I will have to teach my son how to never question an officer, how to sit up straight with your hands on the wheel and don't you dare move them. I'm angry that one day I'll have to teach my son to always look an officer in the eye. One day I'll have to teach my son to never sag, never gangbang, to never smoke, to never communicate with the wrong crowd. I'll have to teach him how to survive, but also how to stand your ground and how to show your blackness everywhere. Show them that you have a mother and a family that have taught you how to love and how to be." I think it's really a sweet poem. And then I know I'm at time basically, but we'll just conclude with this poem by another one of our campers that was also written on our Rage Day, called "Did I Upset You?" And oops, that's my timer. Sorry. Okay. So you told me to sit up straight like a young lady should, but I slouched over like I'm a basketball player on the sideline. Did that upset you? I spoke about the issues in the Black community that are faced by us people every day, and it got a lot of attention on social media. Did that upset you? I went to the police station and demanded answers on why we're the only ones being killed for no reason, and I stayed until there were answers. Did I upset you? My friends and I came to the restaurant a little loud, but what you claim to be ghetto, we just got louder. Because you say we're talking shit, but we're just having fun. Did that upset you? I came to an interview for a job that is male dominant, and I got a job and achieve above and beyond all the men there. Did that upset you? Many things I do for me, I do for me. I don't do it to upset you. That's just the enjoyable part of it. So some nice sassy energy for us to conclude. But yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you all. Thank you for listening. And yeah, I'll just close.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fantastic. I think we all really enjoyed the poems, and I think there was some talk in the chat about how much people wanted a Rage Day. So thank you for that. Our last panelist for the conference, yay, until our keynote, is Emmy Von Taylor, who will be presenting We Don't Even Have a Name, Women Knowledge Workers Show Themselves Out. Emmy Von Taylor is a fourth-year doctoral student in the Department of Education Leadership and Policy at the College of Education and DEI Instruction and Research Lead at OpenStax at Rice University. Her research interests have to do with how white supremacy shows up in organizations broadly, and more specifically focus on the experiences of those with marginalized identities within higher education. Join me in welcoming Emmy Von, y'all.
I'm on mute. Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm just like actually really full from the previous panelist presentations. And Sarah, I think I will be reaching out to you about possibly including that particular piece of your curriculum in this study because it fits so well. I successfully defended my proposal last month, my dissertation proposal, waiting for all the process to be completed before I refer to myself as a candidate. But I'll be discussing my proposal and I want to spend the majority of my time focusing on the methodology, which embeds some queer methods that attend to the topic and the study population. So really the kind of the feminist and queer pieces of the study are the parts that I would like to focus on. So I am a member of the Great Resignation, having left my position as a director of external relations at a particular institution of higher education. And I started to see other women leaving their roles that were similar to mine. I always knew that I wanted to focus on this particular population in my research because there's not much research about folks like me in higher education. This seemed like a really salient and important and timely topic. To sum up the problem, whether in the public imagination or higher education research, people don't even realize that knowledge workers exist on college campuses, despite the fact that professional staff on college campuses has grown a whopping 28% since the year 2000 and now make up almost a quarter of on-campus staff jobs. At Research One universities, they outnumber faculty. But many people, if they think of professional staff at all, they think of student affairs staff, which means that people who work in marketing, development, information technology, and other business functions are invisible in the literature. This lack of attention matters, and this demographic matters for many reasons, but especially now, as the US is undergoing a massive restructuring in its workforce called the Great Resignation. Early research is showing that women and people of color are leading the way out the door. And I want to mention here that while much of the popular and early scholarly discourse seems to focus solely or mainly on the COVID-19 pandemic as the big contributing factor leading to the Great Resignation, I refer to 2020 as the year of dual pandemics, the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial uprisings that occurred in response to the extrajudicial murders of George Floyd and other Black Americans like Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade. I believe the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial uprisings are phenomena that are intertwined and that we miss accurately understanding what's leading to this large number of resignations if we miss this point. So my hope is that examining higher education and these women's experiences through an intersectional, gendered, and racialized organizational lens will allow for a more comprehensive understanding of how the organizational structure of historically white institutions of higher ed operate and affect women who work within a level of the organization not yet fully explored. To learn about this, I asked 3 research questions. What, if anything, do the participant stories reveal about the organization as a gendered and racialized organization, which gets at the macro level? What, if any, elements of the organization structure as understood and revealed by the participant stories affect their decision to resign, which gets at the meso level of the organization? And what stories do women share about their experiences working as non-student facing professional staff within a historically white institution of higher ed in the US that led them to resign from the organization during the Great Resignation? And that gets at the micro level, the personal. So to address these questions, and I'm going to kind of try to blow through the conceptual framework, but if you have questions, we can go back. I use a conceptual framework that is both guided by intersectionality as a theoretical framework as defined by Esposito and Evans-Winters, and embeds intersectionality as articulated by Crenshaw. I add Acker's work on gendered organizations and inequality regimes to help study how the macro level, how gender and its connection to organizational constructs at the meso level operate, and how they influence the experiences of staff at the micro level who work within the organization. Acker's theory posits that organizations have an invisible substructure, processes in which gendered assumptions about women and men, femininity and masculinity are embedded and reproduced, and gender inequalities are perpetuated. The most common inequalities that we can think of are the wage gap between women and men and the sex segregation of jobs, occupations, and hierarchical positions. Adding both gendered organizations and inequality regimes to the conceptual framework, I hope, will provide a more holistic intersectional lens with which to answer the research questions. I then add Ray's theory of racialized organizations to the framework because I suspect that inequality regimes doesn't go far enough in examining the impact that our society's racialized constructs have on organizations within our country. His 4 tenets describe phenomena within historically white institutions, such as unequal resources allotted to DEI initiatives, unequal pay allotted to racially marginalized workers within the institution, as well as things like decoupling or the incongruence between official organizational policy and actual practice as evidenced by human resources enforcement or their lack of enforcement for claims of discrimination. My hope is that by combining all of these theories into a conceptual framework, I can get more closely at how white supremacy functions within historically white institutions of higher ed and how it affects professional staff women who work within the org. I believe that a study on the attrition of women knowledge workers would extend research on mid-level professionals and attrition in higher education, as well as provide timely research on the experiences and retention of knowledge workers during the Great Resignation. And I want to say here, I haven't really described or explained here what knowledge workers mean, but I do in my fuller research. But basically, knowledge workers, as defined by Drucker, are folks who work with information, who think for a living. Student affairs folks are knowledge workers as well, but they already have a name within higher education. Those of us who have worked in these other professions don't have a name that kind of helps to get at our experiences and the work that we do. Applying an intersectional lens that explores the experiences of staff women who are knowledge workers in the academy also would contribute to gender studies as well as race and ethnicity studies. Higher education needs more dedicated research on knowledge workers in order to understand itself and those who work within it. We can't understand how the academy functions without understanding all of the people who labor within it. So the study's methodology and design, this will be a critical ethnographic case study guided by intersectionality. This design and this methodology allows me to examine and critique systemic inequities as revealed by the participants. While traditional organizational theory scholars often study organizations by looking to leadership or centering the study of structure through examination of policies and procedures, I believe that that way of studying organizations without centering staff, and especially staff at lower echelons of the organizational and social hierarchy, is incomplete and obscures white supremacy embedded within the organizational structure. With this belief in mind, I want to study organizations by flipping the focus to center the experiences and ways of knowing of marginalized people to learn about the organization and white supremacy embedded within its structures and practices. By including autoethnography, I start with myself. And in doing this, I acknowledge that neutrality and objectivity are myths, and that fits with my critical stance. I include my embodied experience as a queer Black woman in the work of researching my own community, bringing integrity to the work and eschewing a long-held criticism of ethnography, which is about researching the other. So traditional ethnography is about understanding, observing, and describing a unique culture and community. I'm describing a community and a culture that I'm also a part of. It's one of the ways that I disrupt traditional research methodology, which is a hallmark of intersectionality, and it adds a queer methodological approach to my methodology per Adams, Jones, and Ellis. And it's a case study bounded by a single institution of higher ed, which allows me to go deep within the org, but then also look more widely across the org at multiple departments and divisions and colleges within the organization. The study privileges stories and the lived experience of women, including myself. It builds upon a pilot study I had a chance to conduct during the summer of last year in Dr. Patricia Summers' Women and Gender Studies class. So that pilot study garnered 9 women participants who were Black and white, straight and queer, and represented 5 distinct units within the university. And it's important here to note that 2 of the participants use both she, her pronouns and they, them pronouns. So I may end up changing my dissertation title to reflect the inclusion of non-binary identities and not to invisibilize those folks. I used a snowball approach to find participants who left Haven University. And I consider the snowball approach a decidedly feminist approach because it relies on relationships between and among study participants. I'm also giving away some age stuff here by showing this old commercial of Fabergé shampoo with Heather Locklear, where she says, try it and you'll tell your friends about it and they'll tell 2 friends and so on, which is basically the kind of approach that I've used to get participants for the study. That approach has been really effective. I reached out to women that I saw who were leaving the university near the same time that I left. They also named others who they knew were leaving. And the pilot study represented marketing and communications, development, information technology, and program management, and 5 colleges or units within the organization. For the dissertation, I'm increasing the number of women, and I've already got 16 participants, and that's all through word of mouth. The ethnicity and racial diversity has increased. So originally I had Black and white women. I now have AAPI and Latinas in the study. Let's see, let me go forward here. And then here I'm going to point out some of the selected methods and design choices that I made. Because I understand from my own experience in making the decision to leave the organization, that the decision wasn't an easy one to make, and that I had experienced issues related to trauma that led to that decision. So I wanted to help provide space for healing and included journaling and journaling prompts. I solicited work-life stories and personal narratives as well. I did a semi-structured interviews, and these are also methodologies and methods that I will be using for the dissertation. And in those semi-structured interviews after the surveys, those were in a conversational style because again, I'm a member of the community I'm studying and it's a way of troubling traditional methodology. And by doing the interviews via Zoom, it allows me to review and observe our conversation and memo, which fits with the ethnographic research methods of using observation as a method. I also asked participants to share a metaphor to talk about their experiences, which is using familiar words in unfamiliar ways. And some of those metaphors were sharecropping, plantation, working in a basement, as opposed to the ivory tower, and that high school cafeteria. And then I also wanted to bring up how I'm using online tools. We have a Slack group that is for all of the women who want to participate, because women wanted to meet each other. They wanted to develop community, and the Slack group allows that community to develop. And I'm not using the Slack groups for knowledge gathering for me for the research, but more about community building. And so that they can also share resources and experiences with each other. And then we're also doing online circle groups. These images are not people who are in the dissertation. The online circle groups, I will be collecting information from, but that's also a way for folks to talk to each other and learn from each other. And those are also methods that are used or come from Black women's sister circles, as well as queer online community building as well. And then I will be gathering and analyzing artifacts mentioned by participants, as well as those suggested by the theories that I'm using, such as anti-discrimination policy and procedures, documents, and job descriptions. And then finally, every decision about the construction of this critical ethnographic case study is guided by intersectionality as a theoretical framework. Those choices ground the study in the lived experiences of a group of women who have not been explicitly and purposefully centered in academic research, despite the fact that women knowledge workers have given of their talents within academia since before the term was coined by Drucker in 1959. Academia has much to learn, particularly from those who've been marginalized, not only because of their sociocultural identities, but because of their position within the gendered, racialized structure of historically white institution of higher education. This study doesn't seek to give voice to these women. It seeks to amplify their voices, our voices, in a language that academia can understand, in order to provide academia with the opportunity to learn from us both how white supremacy functions within a single institution of higher education, as well as how the academy can use this knowledge as a tool of liberation. One of my committee members commented that it was clear that I wanted to be careful to protect my participants' anonymity, but what about my own? And so I wanted to close with two quotes from Audre Lorde. One, your silence will not protect you. It has taken me more than 30 years in working in historically white institutions, including 20 in higher ed, to find and use my voice. Silence shrouds us, it smothers us, and it robs us of liberation and joy. The second is, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I'm well aware that in writing this dissertation and pursuing this PhD, I'm using the master's tools, but in this project, I'm using those tools to hold a mirror to the academy. I'm also highlighting that all of the women in this study actually use their agency to liberate themselves and leave the master's house. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you so much. All of these presentations were so enriching and thoughtful. And I just wanted to open up the room for any of the panelists to respond to each other. I know that there was some back and forth in the chat, but I just wanted to open it up in case anybody wanted to say anything, or if anybody had any questions, feel free to either leave them in the chat or you can unmute and yeah.
I wanted to share a story that I was working on campus in the staff position that I hold, and I was Xeroxing Audre Lorde's I forget which article, and it jammed the copier, and I was like, here you are, Audre Lorde, jamming up the master's tools. Like, I just thought that was wonderful. Like, yeah. Anyway, that's it.
Thank you for sharing that, Jackie. And Yvonne, thank you for closing on that quote. I would love to hear all of the other panelists like kind of speak to this idea that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. I think there's connections amongst all your work around students and inhospitability and the responses to that. So I'd be interested to hear about what you all believe is possible and what your sort of dreams and desires are in the work that you're doing, and perhaps even, you know, what you're hearing from the students or the populations that you're working with.
my research is definitely a little bit more on the like quantitative side. I'm not doing interviews. I'm not doing, that kind of same research. But something that I have noticed a lot is whenever I look at who is working in the spaces, I know I mentioned in the presentation, but students are really running a lot of the things, especially the physical spaces that I found. And so I think that, I don't have like a fully formed, like this is the thought that I have, but something too that I've seen has been, for sure, students are leading a lot of things. The staff that are working in these spaces, I don't have like a number to throw out there that's guaranteed, but I want to say probably like 80% of the staff that I have seen working in these spaces use they them pronouns, which I think is interesting. And so I think that that's something that I might take with me in future, just because, like I said, I'm still doing a lot of this work.
I mean, I can share just thinking about that quote that I really love so much too. I think it's instructive because, it just reminds us that we have to build something new ourselves, but also I think, like, just speaking personally in my experience, like working with this youth program, like it's it's all there already. It's like the alternative, like we have it inside of ourselves already. And I think when you're in these community spaces and you can talk about it and see it reflected in one another, it's like I don't know, that's what's inspiring to me. It's like we have to build something else, but like it's very much possible when it in those moments.
That quote, I think I reflect on it a lot being in academia, using these tools, and trying to reflect on my own sense of integrity. How do I do this and do this work and be in these institutions while also trying to use information as a tool of liberation, and also trying to either change the institution or create something else. I don't have an answer that, there's nothing that I can say, well, this is how I've got it. That it's something that I think I'm always going to be reflecting on, always trying to like push myself and grapple with. I think that it's like ongoing work and not like a single solitary answer for me.
I'm sorry, I am so brain dead at this time of day. So like I need to take a nap right now. But everyone talking about institutions was making me think about something that, so I don't know if I can even put this sentence together, but the difference between a lot of the presentations talked about individual students or groups of teachers or groups of knowledge workers getting together to create these different forms of support groups. And I noticed that even when those support systems are, when they are institutionalized, they can kind of lose their value and become the master's tools again. So now that DEI is like a hot topic and there's all of these DEI jobs where people are supposed to create all of these numbers about how much they're promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, now that that's been institutionalized, I don't know, it makes me skeptical that those efforts will achieve the outcomes that they were supposed to. But when it comes from a group identifying what they need, that's when there's often the most, benefit for the people involved, and a kind of support system can be created. I mean, I don't know if that made any sense, but the presentations were all amazing.